now is probably closer to 2 or 3 in terms of how optimal it is. But I think we also want to look at this from another perspective. Yes, in general, you would like U.S.-China relations to be good and for the two countries to be collaborative and cooperating with each other. That's sort of the ideal that most people have. On the other hand, if one or both of the countries are moving in a direction which is really inconsistent with the interests of the other and with their global commitments, then the frictions that they have would also be natural. You don't want the US to be supportive of a China that is going in a direction which is diametrically opposed from what the US and the international system would want. And you wouldn't expect the Chinese to support a US if it was, going in a radically opposite direction. I think right now what we have are two countries that really think the other is doing things that are inconsistent with their bilateral commitments and with the way they think the world ought to work. And so I think actually some of the frictions are to be expected and actually constructive, because you don't actually solve problems if it's just a lot of happy talk. There may be too much unhappy talk at the moment, but I think it's worthwhile that you have Americans, Europeans, folks from Korea, Japan, and elsewhere pointing to things that they find, problematic about China. And I think it's not always a bad thing for the US to hear voices inconsistent with the conversation in Washington or other allied capitals. So is the relationship optimal right now? It's not. But is there some constructive elements coming from the tensions that are generating a debate? I think that we ought not to totally dismiss the value of that. Certainly, the US and China have different stories about who's to blame. From the perspective of China, the relationships started to tank in January of 2017 when the Trump presidency started, and the US launched the trade war against China. And then in 2020, even after the Phase 1 deal, the US implemented a whole series of sanctions and penalties over the course of the last year of the administration. The Biden administration has continued with those. That's the Chinese story. It's 100% the US's fault. China is blameless. And of course, the view from Washington is actually the story goes back to at least December 2001 when China entered the WTO, and over the course of the next 15 years, gradually moved the economy away from China's commitments to the WTO. And then the US really had no choice but to take different steps to try and address these long-standing problems. So both sides have a very different view of who's at fault. I think there's some reasonable positions that both sides have about things that the other could have done that have destabilized the relationship. Certainly, I think it's basically true that since Xi Jinping has come into power, that China has stepped further away from the reform and opening path it was on before, and has generated a great deal of animosity, not just from the United States, but from Europe, from several of China's neighbors, and elsewhere. This is not an America-only point of view, but certainly I think there's reasons that China has justifiably to view that some of the tactics that the U.S. has had overstepped some of the boundaries that we had in place. Certainly the launching of the trade war and other sanctions the U.S. has taken has really shaken China's faith in the international rule of law, the WTO system, and the U.S. as a credible, long-term, dependable supplier and customer. I think both sides share some of the blame. I don't know if I could say it's 70-30 or 80-20. In my office, I give both sides. I say it's not 50-50, it's 100%, 100%. Everybody's got responsibility to communicate and explain, and I think both sides are falling short on that right now. No election that I can think of in the US, congressional, presidential, has turned on China. The reasons that there is unity on China is a common view of where China is going. and how that seems to be inconsistent with American interests, their view of the international system. If you talk to members of Congress or people in the administration, they can give you plenty of examples that put meat on the bones of why they are genuinely worried, and they're not doing this strictly out of political logic about what's going to get them past the next election. Given all of that, the US isn't going to just sort of easily turn on a dime after, say, the midterms or some other election. It's going to take some movement on China's part to address some of those concerns. China's not going to address all of them, but if they would show at least some recognition that some of the responsibility, and I would say probably more, lays in Beijing, and that there's some things that they could do, I think that would be an important step. Both sides say the ball's in the other side's court. We're playing with multiple balls. I don't know what the right sports analogy is here, but if China does not really significantly modify its approach on Ukraine, and if it doesn't do more to reassure the United States, not just about American businesses that are on the ground in China, but about the effect of Chinese industrial policy to global markets in a whole variety of industries, if they don't reassure the rest of the world and take steps to modify a strategy which is about taking advanced technologies that are on the commercial space and applying them to their military, which makes it difficult for Western suppliers to feel comfortable providing technology to China, it's going to be hard to move on those substantive issues. I think there's also things that the US can do about clarifying what types of technologies are within the bounds and what's out of bounds. I think right now there's a lack of clarity and uncertainty that the Chinese have, that the business community has, about what businesses you can do with China that is acceptable and what's out of bounds. And so I think that clarity on the US side would help quite a bit. So there's a lot of work to be done. The data from surveys by AmCham China, AmCham Shanghai, the Eurochamber, the surveys we did on Taiwanese firms shows the business community's level of anxiety is at an all-time high. Part of that is zero COVID and the implementation of the policy, particularly in Shanghai. But since Shanghai is central to the entire Chinese economy, everybody throughout the country has felt it. But even in Beijing, a great deal of anxieties and a sense of uncertainty about what the future brings. In addition, China's economy has slowed down quite a bit, partly because of the pandemic, but partly for other reasons. And so that has led to worries. I would say there is headquarters amongst major companies, whether they're American or European or otherwise, they just have huge question marks and anxieties. Companies used to primarily be focused on how do we maximize our profits, how do we maximize efficiency, how do we have global supply chains that are just in time, and now I think it's all about how do we minimize the downside, how do we hedge against potential problems, how do we address risk, how do we prepare for just in case, and you hear that everywhere. And CEOs, C-suites, they don't like to fence sit and just wait forever. So a lot of them are already making adjustments with their businesses' global strategies. And China is less central to those global strategies. China's a giant market. So I don't think companies, even if they're moving some of their operations here, are giving up on the China market because it's just too big. At the same time though, new investment, new employees, new R&D, I think they're all waiting on that or looking at other places. Now there are exceptions to the rule, but I think broadly speaking, folks' sense of fear and anxiety is a lot higher. That's also increased by the fact that they don't feel comfortable coming here. So I don't know of any Fortune 500 global CEO that has landed in China in the last couple years, or that would get the nod from their teams that it'd be a good idea to do so right now. This is just, 10-day quarantine, and then possibility of further quarantines and other types of restrictions. That's just a big risk. And so if you can't be on the ground, then you can't talk directly to your local team. and you can't get a different perspective. And so I think that what we're seeing is a growing gap between headquarters of companies and their teams here. At the same time, there's a growing gap between the representatives of American and foreign companies here and the Chinese government. Because the Chinese government has obviously got a lot of views, critical views of the US government, and to some extent, some of the positions of businesses. And so I think that puts the representatives of American companies here, particularly those that are from China, in a difficult spot. They're having a difficult time communicating back home, and they're having a difficult time getting the ear of officials here. So I would say this has to be one of the most challenging times for companies that I can remember. China's economic slowdown is affecting everybody. You're seeing less investment, not just by foreign companies, but most importantly by China's private sector, the largest share of China's economy. You're seeing much less consumption by Chinese consumers, who are saving more and more for the rainy day that they're currently going through and potential future rainy days. I think it's that combination of anxieties by everybody that is getting the attention of folks in Beijing. Foreign companies' contribution to total investment in China is a lot smaller than it was before. It's less than 3% now. It's in very important industries and segments of those industries, and it helps connect China to the rest of the world, which is critical to any potential hope for improving Chinese technology upgrading and productivity and accessing overseas markets. But China is a continental-sized economy like the US or Europe, and so the large weight of the economy, and probably what is most important to officials in Beijing, is where's the domestic economy overall going? But that's going, actually, the sentiment is the exact same. Consumers, producers, domestic, foreign, they have the same anxieties. And so I do think that they are getting the message that the status quo is unsustainable, that they do have to address the challenges that zero COVID policy is creating, as well as other longstanding problems that are exacerbated by zero COVID, whether that's real estate and the financial sector, demographics, and inequality across regions. So I think they're seeing all those problems, and that you may see some steps to address them. But I think we also have to remember that this is a relatively nationalistic leadership that doesn't have a lot of faith in markets fixing everything. So even if they recognize that these problems, their idea of the portfolio of policies that they're willing to consider to address these are probably different from my list of policies. So I think we will probably see some new things in the wake of the 20th Party Congress, but it's probably not going to be ones that deviate radically from the current trajectory. And probably the international business community will say, those are policies that address the symptoms, but not the root causes of these issues. If liberalization and further opening is the metric, I think we found Xi Jinping to be a relatively fair weather reformer, where he tried early in his administration to liberalize, then he ran into a sea of problems with the housing market and then with currency and the stock market. And I think he got incredibly gun shy, and that led him back to where he feels more comfortable, which is using state and party control. Well, I think there's some companies that get a hearing because they are at the top of their industries. And I think that's mattered. I think the early visits in the 1980s by companies like IBM helped give China a sense that being connected to the world offered a lot of benefits, things that they could learn from. So, Elon Musk, and think of Tim Cook and others who can get a hearing here. Their voice can be important if they use it in the right way. But I think broadly speaking, you're right. That's why there are organizations like AmCham Shanghai that can represent the collective wisdom of their members. I do think one of the broad challenges for companies, and they're talking with Beijing and with Washington, for the most part, the tendency is to either say nothing or say nothing offensive. They just hope that they don't get caught in the crossfire, or that cooler heads prevail. And I think that that's a reasonable approach during normal times, but I don't think we're in normal times anymore. So I think that individual companies and associations, chambers of commerce, need to figure out how to create a message that lets governments, including in Washington, believe that they are cognizant of the anxieties and worries that Washington, D.C. has, or other capitals have, and that they can do business in a way that helps address those anxieties and maybe help solve some of those problems. So I think that there is broadly a competitive relationship right now between Washington and a lot of businesses on the ground here. And I think that that needs to be adjusted, partly through Washington and getting a better sense of what the advantages to the United States are of just having American companies here in general, but also by companies here thinking of ways that they really can address those concerns that Washington has, whether it's related to technology transfer or even issues of human rights. I think that there's a lot that the business community can do to play a more proactive role in getting the relationship in a more constructive place. Well, I think foreign companies in the Chinese government's eyes will always be foreign companies. But I do think, yes, from a perspective of being able to access multiple markets and avoiding the potential risks, reducing the risks that come from tariffs or investment bans or restrictions, having duplicative supply chains and businesses can help in that regard, and having more localized leadership can as well. But I would say that there's a downside to the duplication and localization, which is that it's a globally very competitive world. So if you don't bring your A game to China, your chances of success here are lower. So yes, you can localize, but if you are facing serious domestic Chinese competitors and from elsewhere in the world, and the regulatory board is slanted against you, then if you're not bringing your A game, you're going to have a harder time. And that also means that globally, you're not going to be using as effectively as you could all of the assets and knowledge and experience that you get in the China market outside. So you then won't have your A game internationally as well. So China plus one strategy is a reasonable reaction to the various geopolitical tensions and supply chain resilience issues and fears that people have. But at the end of the day, companies need to bring their best people, technology, management, strategy everywhere. Dividing oneself between China and the rest of the world, I think at the end of the day, is going to make those goals more challenging to achieve. First of all, I think the US steps are highly focused at the most advanced areas of semiconductors, and is not a broad blanket ban on the semiconductor industry's business in China, and could be consistent with an overall strategy of calibrated coupling, where you have restrictions in specific areas of technology that are relatively fortified, which is what these measures issued last week do, but still allow commerce and investment, even in technology sectors that don't have the potential for flowing back into China's military and creating national security risk for the United States. That's how I would interpret what the US steps are meant to do, not a blanket decoupling or outright boycott of China and high technology or anything like that. I think the Chinese reaction will be important to watch. So far, obviously, China has taken a variety of reciprocal steps when the US, for example, expelled Chinese journalists, closed the consulate in Houston, but we've not seen that specifically in areas of advanced technology. One of the reasons is China is still highly dependent on the rest of the world, including the United States, and any steps they take, they know will result in further actions from the United States. So I think for them, restricting exports of rare earths or penalizing some large American supplier, putting some company on the unreliable entities list, launching an anti-monopoly case against an American company here. Those are all things that they could do, but if they step across that Rubicon, they are basically saying our relationship is unrecoverable. And I think they want to leave, for the moment, want to leave space for the possibility that we might be able to improve relations somewhere down the road. So I think everyone obviously has to do all their own scenario planning, and that's going to raise everyone's anxieties and generate more hedging. It just feels like the last 5 years has been a slide into greater and greater uncertainty, which is leading companies to reconsider everything. And I think we'd all just like a break and hope that we might be able to get to some more stable equilibrium. Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that we're going to get there. We're just going to have to adjust to this new reality. I guess I shouldn't be surprised by the direction China is going in, given its leadership and what we've seen in speech after speech and document after document. China's been very clear about its analysis of the direction of the world, their concerns, and the type of international order they want to create. But they are generating a great deal of pushback and mobilization, not just in the short term, but in the long term, because of those policies and that vision. If you go back to January 2017, when Xi Jinping went to Davos to speak at the World Economic Forum, and read the text of his speech, it was a very optimistic speech, a forward-leaning speech about how China could play a very constructive role in the international system. If China had implemented half of what was in that speech, or even a quarter of what was in that speech, while the US was in the midst of moving in an isolationist direction, in itself generating a backlash from others, think of where China would be today. But that's not what happened. Instead, they stuck to their original plan, and therefore they have generated a significant amount of resistance and resentment from others. Now, of course, if you look at global surveys, there's a range of opinions. If you look at a variety of developing countries, authoritarian countries that find common cause with China. But broadly speaking, if you ask, what's the part of the world that's been most important to China's economic success, to its stability over the last few decades, it's the countries that now are the most concerned about China. So I think it's in its self-interest to try and find the courage to adjust policies and its approach to improve relations with the US and with Europe. I think that's would improve China's economic future to deal with demographics and the other challenges that they face. It would improve the national security environment. China shares a lot of borders with many countries on land and water, very complex. And if those relations around China's periphery continue to intensify as they have, how is China going to have the resources and energy and attention to address the domestic challenges? So I would encourage them to consider taking some steps that would do more to reassure the rest of the world. I don't think that taking those steps is simply accepting an American or Western narrative, and I don't think they are a step to China's collapse or being controlled by others. I think it's in China's self-interest to make some significant adjustments. How likely are we to see that? I don't think that's the most likely trajectory, but I think it's the responsibility of scholars and observers to identify these challenges and potential pathways to a brighter future for China.